Noah built the ark out of gopher wood. The flood it came and the ark it stood. And Noah's ark's a moving, a moving, a moving. And Noah's ark's a moving, a moving along. Who built the ark? Oh, Noah, Noah. Now who built the ark? Oh, Noah, my Lord. Noah's ark's a moving, a moving, a moving. Noah's ark's a moving.
I'm Chris Breslin.
And I'm Liz Weiss.
And this is RTN Theology number 32. We'll call it 32A because we have another two-part episode. Liz, you are joining me from a different coast than last time I talked to you. What's that about?
That's right. Oh, do we have time for that?
Yeah, we have time for that.
Long story short is that I was living in a really nice two-story, two-bed, two-bath condo for very little money in the West Village in Manhattan, and it was incredible. And for the first 3 months I felt so inspired, and I was making music and writing all the time. And then so many things happened. Literally, that would be like a 10-minute story. One includes holding my landlady's head in my legs as she held her S-shaped thigh because her femur was snapped in half. There's so much. I probably should go to therapy after all this. But she didn't realize that she was a part of a co-op when she approved me to move in with her. And let's just say I was the only brown person that lived in that co-op, so they knew that one of these things are not like the other. And I think someone reported me, and I wasn't approved to move in by the co-op because my landlord didn't go about it the right way to request for me to be able to move in. And it's a pandemic, and they gave me the boot. So I said, enough of New York City housing. I'm going back to the West Coast. And so now I'm in LA, surrounded by fires. So in New York, it was a metaphorical fire on top of a pandemic, but in LA, it's like literal fires. The sky is gray right now, and the swimming pool outside in this apartment complex is very murky from all of the ash that has fallen into it.
Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry.
2020.
Well, last week I got the chance to interview two authors, two for the price of one, of a relatively new book called Unsettling Truths. And really wish that I could have shared that time with you or Bob, who both of y'all are going crazy right now. Bob played a sold-out NASCAR speedway last week with the Avett Brothers, a sit-in-your-car pandemic concert. So I'm just back at home, just trying to stay sane with these kids doing teleschool. So, but man, this interview was so good, and it went so long that we're gonna split it and do two episodes, one each week.
That's awesome.
We get to talk with Soong-Chan Rah, who I've loved his work on lament and racial reconciliation. He's a professor at North Park Seminary in Chicago, and also Mark Charles. And we don't really get into it the first half of the interview, but Mark Charles is running for president, so it's pretty wild to get to interview a current candidate for the United States presidency.
Whoa. That's so awesome.
Yeah, I can't wait till the second part of the episode where he gets into that, because his platform is pretty amazing, and his whole commitment to the way he's running his campaign is really inspiring. But also really exciting for both of these episodes, we're featuring music from the Porter's Gate worship project, and you were really involved in making both of these records. Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Well, during the pandemic, we didn't know a pandemic was going to happen, and it was a plan for a group of us to go down to Virginia to record with Isaac Wardell on this beautiful, I think it's 500-acre farm, and there's like multiple houses on it.
Wow.
And just gather in one space and record music. No monitors so that we could hear the other people. It was just like very raw. How do we want this groove to be? And how do we maintain safe as we record these songs that we feel are so important right now? The turnaround, we recorded the second week of July and the record came out last week. But some of the songs
That's insane.
were written back in last year in August, and possibly, honestly, I don't even know what today is, so it could have been written. Some songs could have been written in February. I think I was in Virginia. I really don't remember. So it was really awesome to see people who had been quarantining, being extra safe. Some decided to wear masks the whole time and come together and sing these songs that were less about congregational music where everyone is in one space together. But if people are worshiping from home, what are these songs that people can sing to kind of help them survive through this pandemic? Because it's so unknown and we don't know when things are going to go back to quote unquote normal. And so it was just really incredible to be a part of this. It's always an honor because sometimes I feel so insecure about my writing, but then I'm around people who they want to see people succeed and do well. And you could feel it.
Yeah, it feels so collaborative for one, but also like it's interesting to learn about the timeline a little bit because it feels it's one of those records that feels like, man, how did they know? It feels like albums for now and albums that should exist right now, and I guess it's because they're literally from a couple months ago. So, but man, it's these songs are just so have so much life and so much force. I love them. I was telling you that I made a couple CDRs. Remember what those are for my kids, and they've been playing them on their little CD players before they go to bed. And the melodies and the grooves are so infectious. Like these kids know the songs after a couple times, and it's the sort of theology, sung practical theology that I want in their little heads and kind of burrowing into their hearts. It's really awesome.
I mean, and back to your question about how did we know? Most times I don't think we knew. I mean, of course these songs are about social issues or the inability for American church or just people to mourn well. Like that's just a part of everyday human nature for years and years. But to know these particular songs, how they would be so relevant to everything we're seeing on the news now and the protest and riots and the division and politically as well and spiritually as well. I think it just goes to show that the Spirit is moving. I think that's the power of the Holy Spirit. Like it's out of our control, and sometimes we don't know what we're building until we step back and say, "Oh, that's why." Yeah, I think right now people worshiping from home, sometimes you just feel it in the air, like the somber feeling, and you want to celebrate and we want to stuff and not think about the hardships that are happening. But I think there's a time to acknowledge the hardships that are happening and that are breaking our hearts. And sometimes it's hard to articulate, and the only way to get that out is through song. The same way David, like literally the enemy of Saul, lulled him to sleep as well, right? Like that's so weird that Saul would need someone that he hated so much to like soothe his tormented soul. And I love that your kids love it. I love your kids too. Yeah. But I love that even children love this music, and children are so honest and so pure when they connect to these songs or any types of songs. You know that it has been expressed by something that's bigger than human ability, if that makes sense. I don't know. Yeah,
definitely. So this week we're going to play songs from the Justice songs record and next week from the lament songs record. If you had to choose a tune, they're all amazing, but if you had to choose a tune from each, that we should definitely listen to.
I mean, honestly,
this is probably like when people ask me who my favorite kid is, right? Like you can't really, you shouldn't really.
You have
pick
one in your
right?
heart, but only you know that, and the Lord. I would say from the Justice record, "We Will Make No Peace with Oppression." Like that song, it just feels like such an anthem for what's happening right now, especially like those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And just like using biblical elements and using words that bring people together, and we'll stand side by side and we'll use peace instead of like a gun or a knife or and it's just really catchy. I mean, to be honest, the one from the Lament record, Jesus, When You Gonna Wake Up, that song feels so real. At least to me. And not just in these moments, but in moments past of you just go through so many hardships and you wonder, am I on my own? Did God leave me in the middle of the woods to find my way back to the city? And how am I going to survive in this wilderness? And I think that it might be a song that's so honest that most people would be afraid to say out loud, and so we said it for them. Just to say you're welcome here.
Yeah, that's it. That's what good art does. Yeah, awesome. Well, I hope you all enjoy this conversation, at least the first part of it, and definitely enjoy these songs.
Oh God, our help in the time of trouble.
Oh God, our help in the time of trouble.
Oh God, our help in the time of trouble.
Oh God, our help in the time of trouble.
Oh God, our help in the time of trouble.
Oh God, our help in the time of trouble.
Oh God, our help in the time of trouble. Illuminate the shadow, cast the evil ruler from his throne. Illuminate the shadow, break oppression with your mighty arm. Oh God, our help in the time of trouble.
Oh God, our help in the time of trouble.
Oh God, our help in the time of trouble.
Oh God, our help in the time of trouble.
Oh God, our help in the time of trouble.
Oh God, our help in the time of trouble.
Oh God, our help in the time of trouble. Illuminate the shadow till every idol has been trampled on. Illuminate the shadow till every statue comes tumbling down, down, down.
I'm here with Mark Charles and Soong-Chan Rah, authors of Unsettling Truths, and so good to be with y'all, and so good to have a conversation with y'all and let our audience listen in. I'd love for you, our show is called The Road to Now, and every one of us has a road to now, and all of us collective have a road to now, and I think we'll be talking a lot about history and in America's road to now. But I'd love for you all to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about how you got here today.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. It's great to be with you. Please let me introduce myself traditionally. So, Yate, Mark Charles Inishya, Sin Bekedina Nishla, the Tohiguni Basichin, Sin Bekedina Dasache, the Torchini Dasanella. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our four clans. We're matrilineal as a people, and our identities come from our mother's mother. So my mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and that's why I say Sin Bekedina. Loosely translated, that means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsinbake. Then my fourth clan, my father's father, is Totochitni. That's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I also just want to acknowledge I'm speaking to you today from what's now known as Washington, D.C., and these are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. So I want to acknowledge the Piscataway people. They are the traditional hosts of these lands. They're the host people of these lands. They lived here, they hunted here, they farmed here, they fished here, they raised their families here, they buried their dead here long before Columbus got lost at sea. And they are still here. I've met with some of the Piscataway. I thank them for their stewardship of these lands. I'm humbled to be living on these lands, and I want to honor them as the host people of the lands where I'm living.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark. How about you, Soong-Chan?
My name is Soong-Chan Rah. I'm on the faculty at North Park Theological Seminary. I've been teaching here now for 15 years. And before that, I was a pastor for 17 years. So a part of my work is the integration of the academic world, as I've been teaching at a seminary and writing, but also for the 17 years that I spent in on-the-grounds pastoral ministry. And so that's kind of where my heart lies, the intersection of the academic world and the pastoral world. My background is that I'm a Korean-American immigrant. I came to the US when I was 6 years old and lived for many, many years in an inner city neighborhood in Baltimore. And the neighborhood was an interesting mix of poor whites, poor blacks, and poor recent immigrants. And one of the things I remember growing up in that neighborhood is that we had some significant things in common, mainly poverty. Mainly, we were all struggling to make ends meet. But I realized that despite that commonality, that we really didn't get along with each other. In elementary school, we would have most of us got along. By junior high school, you started seeing the racial divisions. But by high school, you had full-blown gangs kind of divided along these racial lines. And so a lot of my thought process has been around how do we begin to create unity, especially in a place like the church, where the church should give us the narratives and the imagination and the value system of unity. And what I saw was it was just as bad as my neighborhood growing up in Baltimore, that the dividing walls of hostilities were pretty sharp. And so a lot of my writings and my thinking, my teaching, and my ministry has been and trying to answer that question: how do we bring the people of God together across these dividing walls of hostility? So I was very thankful for the opportunity to work with Mark on this book, because it was another kind of a step and conversation starter around this issue of division in our nation and in our churches. But how do we begin to have some conversations that bring us back together?
Yeah, that's great. In the book, you mention, and it might be surprising to some who have been interested in or felt a pull towards conversations around reconciliation and racial reconciliation and multi-ethnic church and those sorts of things. But you all reframe in this book and issue a call for conciliation. Can you talk a little bit about the difference or what you mean in that?
Yeah, I'll start there. So I've been, I'll go back here. I moved back to the Navajo Nation almost 15 years ago and lived with my family for 11 years on the Navajo Nation. And before that, I was a pastor of a church in Denver called the Christian Indian Center. And one of the things I learned, experiences, when you talk with Native Americans about the gospel, you really get a lot of different audiences. You get some people who they've been colonized and they went to the boarding schools and they gave up their culture so that they could have Christ, like my grandparents did. And you have some very strong Christians on reservations. You also have people who were deeply hurt by the church. They were abused in the boarding school. They were hurt by the government and the church, and they want nothing to do with the Christian religion. And so if you're going to be a witness in that type of environment, you really have to learn how to acknowledge the history and what happened in the past and still find a way to move forward. And I was actually doing some work that one of the authors who I really admire, who's done some tremendous work on the Doctrine of Discovery, his name is Stephen Newcomb. We actually quote him extensively in our book. He wrote a book called Pagans in the Promised Land. And I've met Stephen, Pagans in the Promised Land. And I've met Steve several times. I have a lot of respect for him. He and I don't agree on everything, but he is a very important voice in this dialogue. And in the meetings I've had with him, he's been very adamant, publicly stating that the use by the nation, even by the church, of reconciliation isn't accurate, because it implies there was a previous harmony, which just isn't true. And so after letting that sink in, over a number of months, even years of letting that sink in, I began thinking, well, what's the right term to use then? And so one day I was looking and I thought, well, what's the root of reconciliation? It's conciliation. So if reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony, conciliation is merely the mediation of a dispute. Now, I get into a lot of challenges because I talk about racial reconciliation is not the proper term, because if you understand race in America, that relationship never had conciliation in the first place. It started divisive with a division in it, and that division has only grown worse over the years. And so there's no harmony we're going back to when you understand how race was constructed here in the United States. And so the term racial reconciliation, which is hugely popular, especially within Christian circles, I say that's a misnomer. That's not accurate. Now, many Christians will push back and say, well, what about the call of the gospel that we are to reconcile all things back to Christ? Well, that's an entirely different conversation. So reconciling creation back to Christ, yes, that makes sense. Using the blood of Christ to reconcile ourselves back to God, to Creator, yes, that is where we're talking about reconciliation. You see, whether it's the story in Genesis, which we even start out in our book of talking about, there was once harmony in this relationship, and sin caused that division. But that reconciliation is different from the reconciliation we talk about between the races, where race is a human construct, and it was constructed to create division. And so I use the term, yes, as the church, we are called to a ministry of reconciliation, but here in the United States, I am working very hard towards racial conciliation, because that relationship never had harmony in it in the first place. Even at its introduction, in the first sentence in our book, which says, you cannot discover lands already inhabited. When Western Europeans came here with the Doctrine of Discovery and Columbus first landed, his viewpoint was that natives were savages, we were not human, which is why he could claim to have discovered lands that already had millions of people on them, because he did not view us as human. So that relationship started broken, and we are merely trying to add some healing or to bring conciliation into that relationship, really for the very first time.
My motivation for this, or my thought process behind this, is a lot less spiritual and academic than Mark's, actually. Mine comes from Eddie Murphy. So I don't know if you all remember the comedian Eddie Murphy, but I grew up on Eddie Murphy when I was in high school and in college. And Eddie had this great bit about this commercial that was popular when I was in my 20s. And it was a bit about a commercial called Come Back to Jamaica. You all remember this commercial? Come Back to Jamaica. And Eddie would make fun of this commercial because he would say, I'm not going back to Jamaica. A black man going back to Jamaica, going back to the old, what's old is what's new. What's old was slavery. Jamaica was the center for slavery. So he would joke about, what are you asking me to go back to? You're asking me to go back to Jamaica back in the old days, which was the center of slavery. So my motivation is a lot less maybe spiritual, and mine's a little bit more tongue-in-cheek, but I think Mark's making a very important point. Are we going back to a pre-existing relationship that was extraordinarily dysfunctional? So if, for example, black and white say, let's get reconciled, let's go back to an existing relationship. Well, that existing relationship happens to be master and slave owner, slave and slave. And that's not a relationship we want to go back to. We don't want to be reconciled to a previous existing relationship of master-slave. And so this idea of reconciliation, it's nice language if you're the master, and if you want to go back to a pre-existing relationship and you were the one in power, you were the one who had all the authority in this. Well, we don't want to go back to these relationships that were unhealthy and dysfunctional. We actually want to forge a way forward. And that is where conciliation makes more sense than reconciliation.
Yeah, in so many ways, it seems like conciliation is nested in this grand arc of cosmic, divine, human reconciliation, and also take seriously how downstream it is.
More blessed to give than receive, to open my hands to the ones I've deceived, to bring reparation of all I have thieved. Hallelujah, hallelujah, yes, now I can see. Salvation has come. Salvation has come to this house today. What I've taken from the poor, I will give it all away. And the cries won't be ignored. I will give it all away. I will give it all away. Let your justice be restored. I will give it all away. I will give it all away. What I thought was mine is yours. I will give it all away. I will give it all away.
A lot of what this book seems like it's attempting to do, and I think pretty successfully, is rerouting or re-narrating a lot of these stories, and I was really pleasantly surprised in how that was done on the register of imagination so much. And I think you were, in a lot of places, you were specifically talking about Willie Jennings, but also like Charles Taylor and social imaginaries and that kind of realm of inquiry. And so one of the main ways that you're re-narrating is America's history around something that I don't remember learning in school called the Doctrine of Discovery. What is that? Or can you rehearse that narrative, both the traditional narrative and what you're trying to re-narrate?
Well, let me give the background for this, Mark, and then maybe you can kind of jump in with the Doctrine of Discovery part of it. So the framing around this is, you're right, it's about the imagination. It's about how we view our world and the possibilities within our world. Sometimes we call that worldview. Sometimes we call it a value system. I use the term narratives that have shaped our imagination. So it is understanding that we have these stories, we have these assumptions, we have these historical narratives that have been told and retold, and without realizing it, they became embedded in who we are. And so we act reflexively out of that embedded narrative. And it's the stories that get told over and over again. It's the imagination that gets instilled in who we are. So these assumptions, for example, that white culture is superior to other culture. The assumption that white language or white history is superior or central to our understanding of American history. So these assumptions get embedded into our imagination. It gets embedded into our worldview to such an extent that we act out of them. The example that I often use is, it's like a good character actor or a good method actor who gets so deeply into a character that even when they're off camera, they start acting out of that character. So, you don't go up to De Niro when he's filming a mobster movie because he might shoot you because he thinks he's a mobster, even when he's not on camera. So in the same way, we have embedded within our imagination, within our worldview, and the narratives have been repeated over and over again that have led us to act out in a particular way. And these are the truths that Mark and I, we're trying to unearth and unsettle, because we're saying that these truths have been such a part of our narrative that we can't think of the world in any other way. And so we're trying to identify these markers throughout American history, throughout world history, throughout church history, that indicate that there's a certain way of looking at ourselves as people of color, or a certain way that whites look at themselves, or whites view people of color, that there are these imaginaries around how we view one another, how we perceive one another, that have become embedded in our worldview, and we operate out of that. And so one of those things is how the doctrine of discovery became embedded, and these assumptions became a part of the worldview and imagination of American Christianity.
Yeah, and the Doctrine of Discovery, thank you, Soong-Chan, for bringing that up, but the Doctrine of Discovery is such a foundational level worldview for not only the Christian imagination, but for the American imagination, where, just very briefly, the 30-second elevator version, the Doctrine of Discovery, it's a series of papal bulls, edicts of the Catholic Church, written between 1452 and 1493. It's essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are less than human and their land is yours to take. So that's the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people. They didn't think they were human. It's the same doctrine that let Columbus discover America. As I said earlier, you cannot discover lands already inhabited. You can steal those lands, you can conquer those lands, you can colonize those lands. You can't discover them unless your belief, your implicit racial bias is that the people there, Native peoples, are not fully human. So that doctrine gets embedded into the foundations of the country. So our Declaration of Independence, which starts with this inclusive term, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal. Well, 30 lines later, that very same document refers to natives as merciless Indian savages. So it's very clear when they use the term all men, they didn't mean Native peoples. The Constitution, which starts with the words we the people, sounds inclusive. Article 1, Section 2, which is a section that defines who is and who is not covered by the Constitution, it never mentions women, specifically excludes natives, counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. In 1787, that literally leaves white men. That's all that's left. And so this is the challenge. And so that implicit racial bias, that worldview, and let me just help you understand how deeply embedded this is into the American psyche. So just a few months ago, the Supreme Court issued a ruling called McGirt versus Oklahoma. They ruled that the whole eastern half of Oklahoma is reservation land and for judicial purposes, and that the natives tried in courts there need to be tried in federal courts because that's what's required for reservation lands. It was McGirt versus Oklahoma, and many people in that felt that opinion written by the Supreme Court was a huge win for Indian country. And it was in a sense because it stated that the state of Oklahoma nor the courts had the authority to disestablish reservation lands. However, it stated continuously throughout the opinion that any point the U.S. Congress could muster the will, and that's a quote, they could disestablish reservation lands or break treaties with Native nations, and no one, including the Supreme Court, was going to hold them accountable. Now, when you think about treaties, most Americans believe that treaties are a Native issue. So treaties establish where we can have a reservation or what we can do. Can we have a casino? Can we not? They think treaties are for Native peoples, and the nation doesn't need to care about them. Well, during his administration, President Obama negotiated a nuclear treaty with Iran, and then President Trump withdrew from that treaty, right? By doing that, it basically said the U.S. had no right to make demands on Iran regarding their nuclear weapons. Now, just literally a few weeks ago, Secretary of State Pompeo went to the United Nations Security Council and asked that some certain parts of that treaty be invoked against Iran because they weren't keeping the treaty, but we had already pulled out of that treaty. Again, if we pull out, it means we don't have any say. And now Iran is free to do what they want to do, at least as far as the U.S. is concerned. So throughout American history, there's been hundreds of treaties written between the U.S. government and Native nations. hundreds of treaties. They established reservations. They is what behind westward expansion. And most people think, well, and most of those treaties have been broken. And so, again, what was in question in the Oklahoma case was there reservation lands established in Oklahoma? And what people fail to acknowledge is that so let's say the Creek Nation, it was their reservation that was being established. And basically the Supreme Court said, yes, the state of Oklahoma can't disestablish these lands, but the U.S. Congress can anytime they want. Now, most people assume, well, if the U.S. Congress broke that treaty, that would just disestablish the reservation. Well, the treaty didn't just disestablish the reservation in Oklahoma or establish the reservation in Oklahoma. The treaty also is what gave the U.S. government the right to have access to the lands in North Carolina and Georgia, where the Creek and the Cherokee were from. So if the U.S. breaks treaty with the Creek Nation, with the Cherokee people, technically that not only would disestablish their reservation, it would revoke the access the U.S. has to those lands in North Carolina, Georgia, and other places on the East Coast, right? That would make sense. Yep. If you break treaty, neither side is bound to the terms of those treaties. However, the U.S. will say that even if we break treaty, it will disestablish your reservation, but we will not need to give up our access to the lands you vacated. Why? That's because of the Doctrine of Discovery. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because the belief is that you actually, as Native nations, never had access to those lands. Because you are savages, you are merely occupants of those lands, and Europeans, who are fully human, they have the right of discovery to those lands. And so once they discovered those lands, regardless of treaty, regardless of war, regardless of anything else, those lands were now theirs. And so technically, treaty is not only about Native rights in our reservation lands, it's about the right of every American to have the ability to have their house, have their city, have their town, have their state, have their nation be established in the lands where they exist.
Maybe a quick additional note about the word doctrine there, the doctrine of discovery. It's actually interesting because it has a double connotation. The first connotation is that it is a theological doctrine, as in it comes from the Pope, as in is a pronouncement, an ecclesial pronouncement. But there's a lot of theological language around it. In fact, as an evangelism professor, I look at it and I see a lot of evangelistic missional type language, in addition to kind of references to who's made in the image of God or allusions to who is fully God's image and who is not. So there's a lot of theological doctrine within the doctrine of discovery. But then the doctrine of discovery, as Mark is addressing, becomes a political a kind of a political international type of doctrine. So maybe the equivalent would be like the Monroe Doctrine, a statement by a government that says this is how we govern our relationship with other nations and with other countries. So that the doctrine of discovery is a both and. It makes these theological pronouncements, but then it has this implication politically around how nations treat one another, and particularly around how the U.S. government treats Native Americans. So this is a very disturbing conflation of a theological heresy that actually becomes a part of U.S. law.
I love the, again, going back to the describing these in terms of social imaginaries, that seems to have such, in theological imaginaries, like such an ability to view this in a theological angle or lens that you can actually kind of discern that, as Mark was saying, that these treaties get made by the U.S. and they get broken by the U.S. and the U.S. doesn't breaks treaty, but still expects the other people to kind of hold up their end of the bargain in a way that almost maps onto some sort of like providence kind of theologies about God's. You start to read theology, you learn all these ways to talk about God's freedom in ways that God is able to establish covenant and not be bound by anything that God doesn't want to be bound by, and all these things. And so like I love to kind of volley these things around and can start to see some of the sinews start to connect on the ways which some more like vocal critics of state power will say that the state is trying to invest itself in some form of divinity. Like I can see that in the narrative that you're talking about, and I can see that like in the book you talk about all these various misimaginations, like the Constantinian misimagination that Eusebius is bound up in, and the just war and like religious violence that starts to take shape with Augustine and Aquinas, and all these kind of doubling downs on this. And you see the ways in which we've had Stanley Hauerwas on the podcast. It would be one of the foremost critics of the ways the state tries to be Lord in a way that only Jesus wants to be Lord and is Lord, right?
Yeah, I would affirm the failures of the church to, instead of confronting that kind of oppression, actually giving affirmation, maybe even permission for the state to continue in an oppressive way. And when we write about the distinction between a church that is martyred and victims of oppression versus the church that becomes kind of in cahoots with the state, and actually becomes Rodney Clapp, I think, describes it as like chaplains of the Titanic, who actually give credence to bad decisions and give support for disaster. But there's really nothing we can do about it because we bought so much into that system. So I think part of what we're trying to point out is that church's culpability throughout its history of contributing to this dysfunctional narrative, contributing to this warped imagination. So, right now when we try to say, okay, what's the church's role? And this is actually Mark's line, let's get out of bed with empire, because we spent centuries and millennia affirming and giving theological weapons to the empire to do what it wanted to do. And so part of the imagination of the church has been, we are the ones in power. And that's why right now in the 21st century, there's so much confusion about what is persecution? When folks feel like, oh, I'm being persecuted as a white male and my view is not being, is not being affirmed, and therefore I need to go out there and vote for the person that's going to affirm the white male perspective. Well, that's a pretty significant misunderstanding of history and of social reality. So I think that's where the church has contributed to this imagination around exceptionalism, triumphalism, supremacy, superiority. And we have actually furthered this heresy that the Doctrine of Discovery sets up. But we see throughout history that that's what the church has done, going back to Constantine, going back through many of the kind of the formation of the nation. There's been this repeated narrative of the church actually affirming and giving support for this dysfunctional state.
We will make no peace, no peace, no peace.
crossed my mind as you were talking, Soong-Chan, is some of the way this still gets narrated, and you touched on it in this kind of pseudo persecution that's not really persecution narrative, which is some kind of counter narrative to, empire, but it's not extricated enough, right? Like it's still very much embedded in its declension narrative that's very privileged at its core. And what made me, when I think about that particular narrative, I think about like the Benedict option as like the kind of paradigm for the Benedict option, which is like the Rod Dreher, we should live in these small monastic communities that kind of buffer us from the ways the state presses in upon our ability to live our faith and religious freedom or something like that. And what that made me think of was Mark, prior to your family moving to DC, you all living on a reservation in a hogan, which would be like a very specific, different version of this kind of enclave. And I'm just kind of curious, like in your thinking about empire and thinking outside of empire, what did that time for your family, like how did that shape your thinking on this? Like how would you say that time either reinforce or change some of your thoughts?
Oh, that time was massively pivotal for me. I was, prior to that, I was a pastor of a church in Denver called the Christian Indian Center. And as a congregation, we were wrestling with what does it mean to be Native and be Christian? What does it mean to be Indigenous and be Christian? Because most Indigenous peoples were colonized by the gospel. What does it mean to actually understand what we believe is sacred, our own regalia, our own creation stories? How do we keep our culture and yet still follow the teachings of this person named Jesus? And I got involved with a lot of different Indigenous Christians from all over the world through a group called the World Christian Gathering on Indigenous Peoples. And it was a very eye-opening time in that involvement, but which led us ultimately to go back to the Navajo Nation because I was born in a border town, because my grandparents were boarding school survivors and didn't teach the culture to my father. He didn't know what to teach it to me. So I grew up in a very assimilated environment, and I wanted to actually live on the reservation among my people and to experience what I had mostly heard about. And so we moved back, and actually there was a member of our church, and we're related by clan, and his wife was a boarding school survivor and had a hogan out in the middle of nowhere that she said we could live in, my wife and I, and our son. And so we moved back there, and then we were 6 miles off the nearest paved road on a dirt road, no running water, no electricity, out in the middle of nowhere. And we moved back there completely prepared to live off the grid. We were prepared to use an outhouse and to cook by camp stove or over an open fire, to live by candlelight. We were prepared to live off the grid. What caught us by surprise was how deeply marginalized we felt. It literally felt like we dropped off the face of the earth, and quickly realized that there are really only two groups of non-natives who ever go to Indian reservations. It's those who come to take your picture and those who come to give you charity. And neither of those groups actually are interested in building a relationship with you. During this same period, I'm experiencing the historical trauma of my people. I'm witnessing it, I'm observing it. I'm also learning about this oppression, the doctrine of discovery, and the history of our nation that's been so buried. And I'm actually becoming very angry, and I'm feeling deeply marginalized, and I'm struggling with anger and with insecurity, and I'm trying to process through it all. And I'm trying to have a conversation with some of my non-native friends from college, friends who I met other places, who I'm trying to process through this, mostly over the phone or over email because they weren't coming to the reservation. And every time we would start talking about it, I could feel myself becoming more and more angry. And I'd have to eventually hang up the phone because I was going to start yelling at my friends. So I learned how to emotionally disconnect, to talk about these things like I read it in the newspaper. That let me stay in the conversations longer. But then the longer I was in the dialogue, the more my friends would get defensive. It wasn't my family who did that to your people. It wasn't my people who, I didn't do that. And soon they would hang up the phone because they were so defensive and upset. And then we weren't able to talk about the actual history, the actual problem. And I was trying to frame it in a way that would hopefully enhance the dialogue. And one day I was writing a letter to my friends. It was like the 10th time I'm trying to get them to understand what it is it felt like to live on an Indian reservation in the middle of our country as a Native man. And I said, it feels like our Native communities are this old grandmother who has a very large and very beautiful house. And years ago, some people came into our house and they locked us upstairs in the bedroom. Today, our house is full of people. They're sitting on our furniture, they're eating our food, they're having a party inside our house. Now, they've since come upstairs and they've unlocked the door to our bedroom, but it's much later and we're tired, we're old, we're weak, we're sick, so we can't or we don't come out. But what hurts us the most, what causes us the most pain, is that virtually nobody from this party comes upstairs, seeks out the grandmother in the bedroom, sits down next on the bed, takes her hand, and simply says, thank you. Thank you for letting us be in your house.
Yeah.
I wrote that and that's it. That's what I'm feeling. I shared that with people, and people on our reservation, other natives would tell me, it's been a struggle to know how to articulate how it feels, and you're hitting the nail on the head. I would share that with non-natives, and they would come up to me, and instead of getting defensive, instead of getting angry, they would say, how do we say thank you? How do we express gratitude to the indigenous hosts of this land? See, now we're having a very different dialogue. Now, instead of having this dialogue about victim versus oppressor, we're talking about what I think is the heart of the matter, which is a reversal of roles, where we have a nation of immigrants, undocumented immigrants, if you will, who came here, never asked for permission, nor were they given permission to be here, and they live like they own the place. And you have 6 million Native peoples who've been pushed aside to lands off in the margins, being treated like unwanted guests in someone else's house. And so much of what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to reframe that dialogue. I want our nation, 300 plus million, to understand in some very real and practical ways they are guests in someone else's house. And I want our Native peoples to understand in some very real and practical ways we are the host people of the land, and we have to conduct ourselves as the host. There's a difference, and I don't have time to go into it all now, but I preached several sermons on the difference between power and authority.
Yeah.
Power is the ability to act. Authority is the right of jurisdiction or the permission to act. Our nation has a ton of power. For power to be effective, it has to be demonstrated. Our nation has dropped nuclear bombs. We've bought off people. We demonstrate our power on a daily basis. Authority, the right of jurisdiction, doesn't need to be proven, doesn't need to be demonstrated. And when you look at Jesus' life, we think about him as a very powerful guy. But most of what he did that we're so impressed by didn't come from power, it came from authority. He cast out the unclean spirit in the synagogue with authority. He preached with authority. He spoke to the winds and the waves, and they listened to him. When his disciples came to him, he gave them authority to cast out demons, heal the sick. So much of what Jesus did was not about demonstrating his power, but exercising his authority. And that was one of the key understandings of my living on the reservation. What does it mean? As a Native man living on the reservation, I said, I am actually living in one of the least powerful places in the United States, which is an Indian reservation. Native peoples don't even have access to those lands. Those lands are held in trust for us by the federal government. We can't even have the land title over it. We have no power. And yet, you could argue, as the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, we have a ton of authority. And so I spent most of those 11 years trying to reframe that. What does it mean, instead of striving to act out of power, to actually conduct myself as one who has authority? It's a very different way of framing and thinking and even understanding yourself. And yet we see that's what Christ did completely throughout his ministry. He conducted himself not as a powerful person, but as one who had authority.
We believe in the saving power, in the saving power of the name. We believe in the saving power, in the saving power of the name. We believe in the saving power, in the saving power of the name. We believe in the saving power, in the saving power of the name. His name is justice, a mighty fortress, a balm for the weary, a refuge and our strength. His name is power, a strong deliverer. We believe in Jesus' name. We believe in the 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 healing power, in the healing power of the name. We believe in the healing power, in the healing power of the name. His name is justice, a mighty fortress, a balm for the weary, our refuge and our strength. His name is power, a strong deliverer. We believe in Jesus' name. His name is justice, a mighty fortress, a balm for the weary, our refuge and our strength. His name is power, a strong deliverer. We believe in Jesus' name. We believe in the 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 name. Jesus. What's his name? Jesus. What's his name? Jesus. What's his name? Jesus. Say his name. Jesus. Say his name. Jesus. Say his name. Jesus. What's his name? Jesus. His name is justice, a mighty fortress, a balm for the weary, our refuge and our strength. His name is power, a strong deliverer. We believe in Jesus' name. We believe in the name. We believe in the name. We believe in the name.
You just spent more than an hour of your day listening to this conversation, and for that we're grateful. We'd love to continue the conversation by social media, so you can contact us at Bob Crawford Bass, at RevBrez, or through the show's social media at RTN Theology. We'd love to hear the ways that you're experiencing these conversations, the ways that you're sharing them and sparking new conversations, the ways that you're building community, and any ideas you might have for future guests or topics. If you enjoyed this episode, you might enjoy digging back through some of the old episodes, like a recent one with writer D.L. Mayfield on the protest in Portland, Oregon, and also her book, The Myth of the American Dream. You'll probably also like the music featured there from Uncommon Hymnal. You can also go back to episode 21 with Esau McCauley, who just came out with his much anticipated book, Reading While Black. I would love for you to listen back to that Lenten conversation. And finally, episode 16 featured Isaac and Megan Wardell as they were talking about the release of Porter's Gate Worship Project's Neighbor songs. And this episode and the next one feature their new offerings from Justice songs and lament songs. And it's just amazing music. I'd love for you to support them. Go back and listen to them talk about how they make these records, and go stream and buy their albums where you can. This episode was hosted and edited by Chris Breslin and produced by Bob Crawford, Chris Breslin, and Liz Weiss.
Our intro music is A.A. Gray and 7 Foot Dilly. The Old Arcs are moving. And we love to end our show with David Childers' Jesus Said. Please remember to rate us on iTunes and write a review, subscribe to our podcast, and follow us on socials. And please, please, please share this episode with a friend. Until next time, take care.